Well, hello friends, Bishop Andy C. Lewter here, and I'm coming to you with another lesson, another online lesson. Now, this particular lesson and lecture that I'm doing, as brief as it is primarily for the students of our new Life School of Theology, which is primarily held on Saturday mornings here at the Hollywood Full Gospel Baptist Cathedral, 3504 Great Neck Road in Amityville, New York. I have just exited a lecture in live lecture on site done with the students, and I'm doing this video as a follow-up to what I spent 2 hours sharing with our students today. Now, this brief overview won't be nearly as long as my actual lecture today, but I'm putting this in the hands of our students so that they will have a follow-up understanding to the many things that we talked about, and even go over the study questions that we discussed at the end of today's lecture. So let's get started. This is an overview, or rather an introduction to the First Great Awakening. I begin here in terms of introduction. The First Great Awakening comes on the heels of the centuries that preceded it, which include the following. This is a quick overview, historical overview of what led up to the First Great Awakening. What we have are the 1300s. In the 1300s, we have the conclusion of the Crusades. That was the conflict between Christians and Islam in the Middle East. Following the 1300s, we have the Renaissance, which took place in the 1400s. Names like Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci are associated with this time period. That then moves us to the 1500s, where there is the emergence of the Protestant Reformation, which includes names like Martin Luther and John Calvin. That brings us to the 1600s, which is the Age of Enlightenment, and we have names like Rousseau and Locke. Okay, those periods of time bring us to the First Great Awakening. And what I want to talk about now are at least the major items that the First Great Awakening can take credit for. Number one, the First Great Awakening can be credited with several items, the most important of which include the following. It is the basis for the later fundamentalist movement. Now, we'll talk about that a little later on, but the fundamentalist movement, the evangelical movement, the charismatic movement, the holiness movement, the Pentecostal movement, all reside and live on the basis and the foundation that was created in the First Great Awakening. Secondly, it created the context for the American Revolution. One of the things that I talk about is that for many years, people saw themselves as residents and citizens of states. It was the Great Awakening that caused Americans to see themselves as Americans more so than as members of a particular state. And once they saw themselves as Americans and a different country, they then could declare their independence from Great Britain. And then finally, it created a precedent for emotional revivalism. Now, the religious behavior that includes emotionalism today is quite familiar, quite common, but it wasn't always the case. There was a time when people were very quiet and passive and conservative in terms of their religious behavior. The Great Awakening opened the door for people to emote and to be more expressive about their religion. So now let's take a look at what were the major reasons that led to the First Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening came about for several reasons. Some of the most impactful include the following. Number one, colonial prosperity. Many people who came to America became rich as farmers of tobacco, cotton, sugar, and other items, the result being that they became religiously lax and lazy. The more prosperous they were, the less committed they were to their local church and even to their religion, which was Christianity. The second reason was urbanization. People were leaving the outlying and more rural areas and gathering in cities. People were now wage earners, and this population growth and explosion in the city made these cities a primary target for the revival movement of the First Great Awakening. They gathered in places like Boston, Washington, New York, and other places. And then there was this melting pot mentality. By the 1700s, people were not as committed to their religious affiliation as before, and they had become more tolerant of others' religious beliefs. So those who came over in the 1600s as Pilgrims and Puritans and Baptists and Mennonites, now their grandchildren, while they still identified with those movements, they lessened or loosened their grip and their tie and their allegiance to those denominations, and they were quite willing now to respect the religious beliefs of others because they were now living more in a melting pot, and as a result had a melting pot mentality. Now, who were the leading figures of the First Great Awakening? The First Great Awakening had several outstanding personalities associated with the movement. The three most iconic figures include John Wesley, George Whitefield, and Jonathan Edwards. Now, friends, let's take a quick moment and look at each of these individuals with a little more detail. Now, I've talked about them before, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time in terms of their biography, but let's look at some of the high points and highlights of who these individuals were. Let's begin with John Wesley. He was born in 1703. He died in 1791. Of all the figures that we'll talk about, he lived the longest. He was an Anglican priest, and even though he would later on give rise to the Methodist movement, while he lived as an Anglican priest all of his life. He's the father, as I just mentioned, of the Methodist movement, and he was headquartered in England. Now, he came to America. He had a failed preaching ministry in Georgia, went back to England, began the class system, the Methodist movement, but he was primarily headquartered in England, even though his movement was strongly associated with the First Great Awakening. That brings us to George Whitefield, the man with the booming voice who could be heard in open fields because his voice was described as sonorous. He was born in 1714. He died in 1770. He was a Congregationalist in terms of his denominational affiliation. He's mostly known for the establishment of orphanages, and in more particular, he helped to take care of the children of slaves. He was rather passionate about that. He was headquartered in Savannah, Georgia. Even today, there is Bethesda Chapel, which was started by him nearly 300 years ago. It continues to live today. That's George Whitefield. And then we close with Jonathan Edwards. He was born in 1703. He died in 1758. Of the three, he lived the least amount of time. He was a Presbyterian in terms of his denominational affiliation. He was most known for this sermon, Man in the Hands of an Angry God. And he was headquartered in Boston, Massachusetts. What's interesting here is that both the Congregationalists, of which George Whitefield was a part, and the Presbyterian denomination were the two denominations that most resisted the First Great Awakening. So it's a bit of irony, almost awkward, that two of the most prominent figures in the movement were produced by the denominations that were the most resistant to the activity and even the existence of the First Great Awakening. What were some of the problems associated with the First Great Awakening? Now, the First Great Awakening was extremely successful and positive, but the harsh reality is that there were some negatives that came out of the movement. Those problems include divisions. I want to take a look. There was a split between the northern wing of the First Great Awakening and the southern wing. There was a further division between those who supported the First Great Awakening. They were called New Lights, and those who opposed the First Great Awakening. they were called old lights. And so you have this schism and this divide between the old lights and the new lights. Now you'll notice that kind of goes back to the age of enlightenment. There is a tie there that I don't have time to talk about here. And then one of the final problems is that it blurred the line between authentic and legitimate revival emotionalism and then extreme radicalization. What I am saying is that there was always the question of how much is too much, or it does not take all of that. And the division between what is appropriate religious behavior and then what is acceptable emotionalism that's tied to behavior. You had the Shakers, you had the Quakers, you had the Pentecostal movement much later on. But the line between what is legitimate religious emotionalism and what is fanaticism, what is extremism or radicalization, that line becomes blurred, and it is part of the divide and the problems that was incurred by the First Great Awakening. Okay, real fast now. I've given you a lot of information, and again, this is an abbreviation of what I've shared with our class in class today. Let's look at the study questions for the First Great Awakening. We begin here, questions 1, 2, and 3. What are the 3 things that the First Great Awakening is given credit for having accomplished? Let me give it to you again. Questions 1, 2, and 3. What are the 3 things that the First Great Awakening is given credit for having accomplished? Questions 4, 5, and 6. What are the 3 main reasons that explain why the First Great Awakening took place? We move now to question 7. Which awakening preacher was born in 1703 and died in 1791? Question 8. George Whitefield was born and died when? When was he born? And in what year did he die? Question 9. Who preached? Which of the awakening preachers was known for the sermon, Man in the Hands of an Angry God? And then question 10. What was the name given to those who supported the First Great Awakening and the name that was given to those who did not support the First Great Awakening? Well, friends, that takes up just about all of my time, and I certainly want to thank you for yours. This is an abbreviation of my lecture earlier today on an introduction to the First Great Awakening. It is primarily being used for the benefit of our students who are in class today, but it may appear on Facebook or on our website or in some other places. I am very delighted to have been able to share these tidbits of information with you. Until next time, do know that I have a number of classes online. That's bishop.teachable.com. bishop.teachable.com. Nothing would please me more than to have you go and check out those online courses as well. And then for those of you who are in class, let me remind, nudge, and encourage you that your core curriculum, your core courses are due. We're moving now toward the close of this academic year, and I want to encourage all of you who have remaining or outstanding core courses to bring your core courses up to date so that you are fully prepared for the final exam, which will take place in about the next 45 days. Friends, I am Bishop Andy C. Lewter saying God loves you. We love you. We look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you for your time today. I look forward to seeing you at some point in the future.